Hello, my name is Paul Zanazanian, and welcome to History in the Now Conversations, a podcast on history and how we use it in our everyday lives. History in the Now Conversations explores how we use history to know who we are, to know how to think and feel, and to know how to engage in our daily routines. History in the Now Conversations examines what history is, what it does, and how we can use it or even should use it in our everyday lives. Today's guest is Michelle Kennedy. Michelle is an assistant professor in the Department of Integrated Studies in Education at McGill University. She is a member of Oneida of the Thames First Nation, raised in London, Ontario, Bear Clan. Michelle is a registered teacher with the Ontario College of Teachers, specializing in junior intermediate Native studies. Her prior research focused on Indigenous community leadership in the area of violence prevention of Indigenous women, girls, and 2S+. Her current work focuses on Anishinaabe art creation, curation, and curriculum development. Michelle, thank you for coming.
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me.
So before we start, I'd like to mention that McGill University is located in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal, in the unceded territory of the Ganyankeh-Hoaka Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Your work seems very fascinating, Michelle. Could you please elaborate or expand on what you do?
Yes. One of the things that I love about working at McGill is it is on Mohawk territory. I'm Haudenosaunee myself. So it's the very first time I've been able in my professional career to work with other Haudenosaunee people. Prior to this, I lived and worked in the Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory in Sudbury, Ontario, more specifically, where I completed my master's and I got a glimpse into academia. So that's really where my academic journey and research started. And I chose Laurentian for my undergrad, and that's kind of how I ended up staying there. And I chose it because it was a very small university with a large complement of Indigenous faculty members and a very strong Indigenous studies program. I think was the second oldest in Canada, following right behind Trent University. So it was a strong pull to have that in my educational background to go there. It's quite a ways away from my home, which is in London, Ontario. But I chose it specifically so that I could be set up for a really strong education. And things just followed. I did my master's. I started my PhD at Laurentian University. And I just continued to build on the relationships that I had established over the years, both professionally, within my research, and in my personal life. So it was a big change for me to come here to Montreal, but I'm really excited to continue the work that I initiated with Anishinaabe people in Robinson-Huron Treaty Territory.
So what did you exactly do in terms of work back home?
In my master's, I worked with people in London, Ontario, who were First Nations leaders in the area of violence prevention. Before the inquiry of missing and murdered Indigenous women, our people have always known there was a crisis. And so there have been many initiatives that were grassroots and community-led, and I wanted to focus on that as an area of strength because it's not like we were just sitting idly by while people continued to go missing and people continue to face violence. So I took a strength-based approach in that area back in London, but also where I was living at the time in Sudbury, Ontario. So working with Anishinaabe, Oneida people in London and Anishinaabe organizations in Sudbury to figure out what exactly these organizations were doing to reduce violence in their communities. And it was a very heartwarming study because these people make it their life's work to address this issue with very little support before the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous and Two-Spirit folks. that's kind of what I did for my master's. After that, I started working on a research project as a research assistant, actually, on an art repatriation project. And so with that, I was tasked with returning pieces of art to people who lived on the Manitoulin Island in Northern Ontario. And that's kind of where my research came to be, is I wanted to, after the art was returned, I approached the school to ask kind of what do you want to do with these pieces of art? And so in a conversation, we decided that a curriculum that would pull on the history of when the art was created, which was in the 1960s, which is the Indian Day School era, focusing on that time and educating students about that colonial history and using these art pieces as a talking point. And so that's kind of where my PhD has taken shape and direction, is building on a project that's previously done excellent work and continuing to build on that in terms of history awareness, cultural sensitivity, and figuring out how to have these hard conversations with youth, specifically kindergarten to grade 3. That's very young, right? Navigating what that would look like in a lesson, what that would look like in a class in terms of support, and figuring out what the impacts of that can be, because when we know our history, it gives us a better understanding of who we are and how to move forward with it, right? And I think a lot of my research has built on the work that has already been done in terms of awareness with residential schools, but there's not much in the area of the impacts of Indian Day School specifically.
Very interesting. So there was a change from the wrongs committed through violence and the wrongs committed through another form of violence, that of stealing art. Could you provide a bit more context for our listeners? You talked about the National Inquiry, and then you talked about returning the art. Is there a common source point that connects the two issues?
The MMIWG 2S research is separate from the research that I'm doing with art repatriation. However, they both have a shared colonial history, right? We know that Indigenous women have faced oppression. Their roles within community have been diminished. We can see this through the Indian Act and how it discriminated against Indigenous women with disenfranchising or disenrolling them from membership. Right? This has since been reversed, but it has had long-lasting impacts. The art repatriation is very interesting because it's the art, I guess you could say, it was stolen, because when you think of repatriation, you think of something has been taken wrongfully and it needs to be returned. It was, I guess I can tell you this little story. There was a scholar and an artist named Robert Aller who really loved art. He worked at the University of Toronto. He also worked for Indian Affairs Canada, and he was tasked with, during the summer months, going to First Nations communities and teaching art skills. At the time, I don't think the ethics were as strong as they are now, because he wrote about, in his scholarly work, he wrote about Indigenous children's capacity to learn art. And I don't think they consented to that. I don't think the communities consented to that. When he appeared in communities, he brought all his art supplies. It was well documented through photographs. And he did teach kids art skills, and he really did love art. The art skills that he was teaching were not Anishinaabe art skills, right? And so when we think about colonial processes, coming into community with the intention of researching someone without their knowledge is really not okay. And so I guess that could be a link between MMIWG and this art repatriation project. People view Indigenous for taking, like Indigenous people for taking. And I guess the link between MMIW G2S, that research project, and the art repatriation project is colonialism, in the sense that Indigenous people aren't seen as someone who need to be consulted about the way they're treated, researched, interacted with in academic ways. When Robert Allard wrote about children's capacity to learn art, it seemed well-intentioned and was obviously would propel any academic's career forward if they're publishing. But when I had been approached to return this art to the community members, some of them didn't even know that it was taken. So Robert Allard actually held an exhibit with all of this art at the Royal Ontario Museum. So he took what he thought was the best pieces, he curated an exhibit, and many people didn't know that their art was in an exhibit at the ROM in Toronto. And there was one person who had actually been looking for their art for many, many years, and they were so thrilled and surprised to receive it back. Many other people didn't have the same reaction. They didn't care, or they didn't have fond memories of that time, thinking about, in the 1960s, how Indigenous people were treated. I guess in the sense when we think about art repatriation, if someone doesn't want it back, what does that look like? And it can mean sometimes rematriation, so they're taking it. I had some challenges where people didn't want to sign a consent form because it's their art. It belongs to them, and I actually have no say in whether or not I can hand it over. I fully believe that if someone has something that was, taken from them, it's at their discretion to do what they want with it. Some people wanted their art destroyed. They said, don't put this in any archive. I don't care what you do with it. And that was interesting too. But right now, the collection of art is housed in Wakwemkong Unceded First Nation in the junior school. And so the teachers can use it as talking points for their art. Yeah.
That's so interesting. So this idea of consent and appropriating First Nations arts, or...
I wouldn't even classify it as First Nations art. It was art created by First Nation children, but the techniques they were taught, and even students, when I had talked to some people, they were just trying to create what the instructor or the teacher wanted them to create. So what were they thinking about? There were images of churches, there were images of the school, there were images of friends or landscapes. So it's really interesting to think about what we would classify as Indigenous art created by Indigenous people, or the actual techniques, because we know non-Indigenous people also practice Indigenous art techniques. Yeah.
So you talked about your educational pathway, and these topics that you've worked on must surely have been difficult or may have aroused a lot of emotions in you. Was it hard for you to stand your ground and be able to engage with the work? Or was it very heavy on you emotionally?
That's a really interesting question, because through my education, I did learn a lot about my history, the history of Canada and its ongoing efforts, violent colonial efforts against Indigenous people. And so initially, I knew I wanted to be a teacher when I entered into my undergraduate program. I did concurrent education at Laurentian University. And I did want to know more about Indigenous people, albeit I was in Anishinaabe territory. So typically when you take an Indigenous studies program, it's tied geographically to the land and the people where the university is situated, as it should be. So primarily I was learning about Anishinaabe ways of being, culture, but it wasn't limited. There were also more umbrella. We would learn about peacemaking, Indigenous education, the foundations of Indigenous peoplehood. I had a class on Indigenous women, Indigenous arts, seeing with the native eye, taught by Dr. Emily Ferries, who's Cree from Moose Factory. And so it also, every class is taught from the Indigenous professor's perspective, which is really unique. So you get, wherever they're from, you get that perspective, right? So when I was in first year, I was learning for the first time the history of residential school, right? I had heard about it. My mother received an apology from the Prime Minister. People who attended residential school received an apology in 2008, a formal one. And so,
Like a letter?
yeah, a fancy letter on like the fancy like parliament paper. And that was the very first time I had ever heard about residential school. I wasn't even in 2008. I think my brother showed me this document in our basement. It was under a bunch of stuff, which I think is also symbolic. It was in our basement under a bunch of stuff. And I didn't really know what it meant. I knew it was not great. And so it wasn't until university that I really had this kind of full circle moment that I came to realize about exactly what happened at residential schools. And as an Indigenous person sitting in a classroom learning that for the very first time, it is shocking. It's a space, it's a sensitive space, I would say, because you're looking around at your peers, most of whom are non-Native themselves, and they're horrified, but horrified in a sense that they're removed from it. You know, it's different when you're sitting there learning for the first time and you're saying, oh, this is my family. And it, as my years of education and my own personal research, right? Once I learned about that, I had lots of questions going back to my family. And so my educational journey, kind of like I was motivated to, figure out, how could this happen? What are the impacts? Like, what are the impacts that I see? And I'm having these kind of like aha moments, right? Understanding my family dynamics and understanding, okay, this is why this person is the way they are, right? And so when I'm learning about history and applying it to my own life and even my own relationships, my intimate relationships, right? It's shocking and surprising, and it's a lot of work. This is outside of my regular student job to do my coursework, right? And so it was a lot at the time. Even I think, if I could say, like, when did I come to the realization, and how long did it take to really absorb that information? I would probably say about 3 or 4 years of continuous learning. There was the TRC at the same time I was going through my undergraduate degree. The TRC Calls to Action came out. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada had come out with their findings, and so there was so much information and research done with survivors to give context to exactly what happened. And so just when you think you kind of know, it's not. It's much more horrific, and the documented experiences are so detailed that it's really hard to deny the impacts that it's had on, not only on First Nation communities, but families, individuals, our ways of life. And so it's it is a lot to come to terms with. But as a teacher, that's where I take my direction in the work that I do, right? I have a strong passion for ensuring that I'm familiar with these calls to action and that my students are familiar with them. There's a whole section on education. And particularly up until now, on campus at McGill, I have had not one First Nation, Métis, or Inuit student. So my work is educating non-Indigenous students. And so we spend a lot of time situating ourselves either as settlers or immigrants or people who have come here and identify as visitors, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about that in relation to Indigenous people and in relation to our teaching and education practice. How are we going to approach our work to ensure that we're having good relations with First Nation people, that we're engaging in history and past history and moving forward in a better way? And so I think for the most part, my students enjoy that exercise. Not all of them. You can read that in my teacher reports, but yeah, it's really interesting. I'm very passionate about really focusing on how to have better relations for First Nations people, because we know that a lot of these new teachers, right, they will go into First Nation communities and teach, because there are jobs, there's tons of jobs. And I want to ensure that their approach is one that comes from a good place, not from guilt, not from like a deficit base, but one that is familiar with the history, that they know themselves, I hope that someone would know themselves as a teacher before they go in there, and they really know the direction that they want to take in having relationships with professional relationships with students and community, if that's the route they choose to go. If not, they still have a really big job educating non-Indigenous students, right? It has a ripple effect wherever they go in their teaching.
It must take a lot of strength and courage to be able to digest your family and your community's history, and to realize that you're an embodiment of those crimes ultimately, and then to be able to, like you said, be a teacher and be resilient and face students and talk about it. Was this an automatic, this is the right thing to do, I'm going to do it no matter what approach? Or did you have to do a bit of soul searching to be able to digest the information, which took 3-4 years, you said, and then to be able to talk about it in an educational forum?
Yeah, the 3-4 years timeline is just gathering information about the history of residential school. I think for the rest of my life, any sort of new phase, I'm going to have these realizations about the impacts of residential school. When I think about becoming a mother, that's going to be much different. It's going to have an impact, right? I can say for certain that talking about hard truths, that's what I'll call them, hard truths in the classroom, I've had so many great examples through my own educational experience, through my peers, through courses that I've taken, where I've seen First Nations people stand up there and explain it in such a honorable, sensitive, compassionate way. And that's where I pull my work from. And it really is inconvenient for students to learn this because it's unsettling their worldview. It's unsettling their relationship to the land that they know, because I'm presenting them with a reality that is much different and cannot be removed. And it's true. They coincide and exist at the same time. So it is a difficult task, and I think I can always improve as well. You know, when I see people presenting things a different way, there's always different approaches to teaching about inconvenient truths. But the way I do it is asking the students to look at themselves first and tell me what they know. And we think about the land, and we think about the people who live in the territory where they live. A lot of students are American, and so they come from the States. And interestingly, their educational background with Indigenous peoples is not as strong as Canadians, in the sense that they didn't know Indigenous people existed in their world, almost, because they don't see them. A lot of times in the city, they don't see Indigenous people. I'll tell you a funny story. One of the tasks that I get students to do in thinking about where they are is this lesson called "Whose Land Are You On?" And so there's a couple links, educational links, where you can put in your address, and it will tell you like which First Nation or Inuit territory you're on. And you can even zoom in and look at the map. It's color coded. It's coded by different cultures. It overlaps, and there's really no colonial borders, like the divide between the States and Canada. And so I had just asked the class at large, I said, does someone want to share where they were born and also whose territory it is? And I had an American student put up their hand. This is my first semester working at McGill. Actually, the second day that I started work, I had just moved here. It was my second day in Montreal. Then I started work the next day. And my aunt and uncle had helped me move in, so they were staying with me. My uncle's from Oneida, the Thames. My aunt is from Moravian Town. It's just outside of London, about an hour and a half. And so I had asked my students, do you want to share where you were born and what territory you're on? And I had this American student put up their hand, and they said, I'm born in New York, and I understand it's the Lenape people, but they're gone. They don't exist anymore. And I said, "Are you sure? Because my aunt is back at my apartment in Longueuil and she's Lenape." And just their face, I didn't mean to do that. But I said, "No, this is a really good example of erasure of Native people from the land." And I said, typically when you can't find evidence of Native people on the land, it's because they've been relocated and put on reserves in territories that are not their own. And so in the case of, my aunt and her community, the Lenape people, they were moved to Canada, right? And this has happened to a lot of First Nations groups. Yeah, so those are some of the things that I like to teach. I think it's a very good first step in talking about Indigenous education, is taking it back to, okay, how do you see yourself? Do you know where you are? We just start there. In terms of my professional world and kind of coming to these realizations of colonialism in my life and the effects that it's had, because you asked me about, resilience and how that is. One of the things that I think about every day is the loss of language. Right? It only took one generation for my grandmother, who went to Shingwak Residential School in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. It only took one generation for her to lose her language. And so my mom doesn't know it. I don't know it. I've taken some introductory classes, but that has a profound effect on my life and my work. I approach my work without as strong of a cultural lens, because I'm not thinking in the language, right? It's not to say that my work isn't Indigenous. I'm just saying that we know languages are tied to the land and interpreted differently. And so when you don't have that, I do think of the world in a different way. And so I've had to do an incredible amount of personal work to figure out how I'm going to get that language back. I take online classes on Tuesday evenings, not as much as I should, but I do have a plan, after I'm done my PhD, to return and commit to learning this language as part of my professional development. And so I'm hoping McGill can come to the realization that this is fundamental work for Indigenous people, right? I don't have my language because of education, because of the education system that existed in Canada. And it has created this situation that I'm in. And especially thinking about, okay, well, I work at McGill and my language is Oneida. How am I going to connect to that living here, right? It poses a very interesting situation for me. So it's going to take a lot of work. I don't know what my goals are. Fluency, I think that's everyone's goal, but I'm late to the game here. So I think as long as I just start and implement in my family, with my own life, the need and urgency to learn, hopefully in the next generations we'll have people who have that as not even a thought. They just want to learn it.
That's an amazing idea. Mm-hmm. One last question before we move to history. So you said that you didn't learn about your family history regarding the residential schools until later on when you went to university. Did you ever wonder why your family never talked about it until then? Or was it something that just wasn't discussed?
Likely we didn't know how. If you think about knowing what I know now, if you think about residential school and its intentional severing of relationship between families, right? They remove children from their parents. A lot comes with that. Your parents are the ones who teach you how to have hard conversations. Your parents are the ones who teach you how to engage with others. And so, of course, my family wouldn't be willing or know how to bring up these conversations. Maybe they don't want to. Maybe they didn't know, which is true. They didn't know about the details of what happened to individuals in our family. And so where is the starting point? And I think it's been a little bit different. I still haven't really talked to my mom about the details of, my grandmother attending residential school. My uncle, I certainly have. I think it just depends on where individuals are at too in their own healing journey, and understanding that they're, everyone's on their different path and a different understanding of how their relationship and the way they are is interconnected with the effects of residential school. And so I just don't think it was the right time. I think they didn't have the skills to engage in these conversations, because that is actually a learned skill, right?
Thank you for that. Let's talk history. All right. So what's the first idea or image that comes to mind when you think of history? Why do you think that image comes to mind?
I come from a mixed background. My dad's white. Actually, my dad's Irish and Scottish. My mom is Oneida. For as many generations as you can think back, I've looked at our family tree. And so when I think of history, I think of my genealogy and who I come from. And it kind of just branches out from there.
Were you always interested in your family tree? Or is it something that you came to be interested in through like the work you've been doing?
I think for Indigenous people, First Nations people, thinking about their family history and family tree is something that we always do. We are who we come from. And so I've always had that interest. I was raised by my mother. And so, I identify more with First Nations culture because that's where, from my mom's side, that's how I was raised. It wasn't until more recently in my adult years that I'm like, oh yeah, my dad, I guess I'm Irish, right? What does that look like?
The name Kennedy.
What does it, yeah, the last name Kennedy is very Irish. What does that mean? And so I've made a significant effort to connect with that side of my family. My dad was born in New Brunswick, and I've asked, what are the family names? Where do they come from? And so my dad's family are like the first settlers of New Brunswick, which is a really interesting dynamic to come from when you think of, my mom's family and her being Oneida for forever back, and my dad's family being, settlers of this land.
Very interesting. So you talked about the image. Now, if you could remember, what is your earliest memory of your connection to history? Does it go beyond or before your interest in the family tree and the image of your father and mother?
One of my favorite movies when I was a kid was Pocahontas. I actually have a picture of when I was 6. I'm blowing out my candles and I have a Pocahontas sweater on, right? And so when I remember, probably around that age, I was watching Pocahontas and I knew she was Native or Indigenous. And I was like, oh, I was thinking of myself and thinking of her and, people coming in on ships. And I was looking at that, I think I was approaching that as a time in history. I think that would be probably the earliest example I could think of, which we know now is Disney was not very truthful about, that whole story and Contact. And
that's interesting.
It was not like that.
Yeah.
That was not the reality. That was not the accurate historical interpretation of what happened. But yeah, I would say that's probably my earliest memory.
Yeah. So you saw a bit of yourself in Pocahontas in a way.
Yeah, because my dad's white, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that also had something to do with it. And I mostly thinking about, when those in Pocahontas, when the ships came in and they were building forts, I was thinking, oh, was that what it was like? Where my people were from in Oneida. I didn't know anything about Oneida being a settlement at the time when I was 6. I didn't know about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. I just knew I had Native cousins on the res and some people in the city. So yeah.
So in retrospect, how do you feel having said this? That you're fine with it, or do you think that it's an expression or a symbol or of something larger in a way?
What do you mean?
Well, because you talked about your earliest connection to history was with Pocahontas. And then you said there were similarities with your own lived experience. But now in retrospect, you're like, that's like so not true, so not accurate. That's like a Disney understanding. When you came to that realization, I would assume it's later in life. How did you feel about your association with like your your initial interest in Pocahontas? Did it bother you, or just no big deal, just my past, and you move on?
Oh, and in retrospect, watching Pocahontas as an adult, I know that's not an accurate reflection of history. And I know that now I know that these images are put out there for viewers to feel comfortable about the interactions of Indigenous people with non-Indigenous people, when we know that's not the history. So it's just a moment that I acknowledge. And I think now, when I think now in my adulthood, what is my interaction with history? It would be my interactions with my older relatives, right? Going to visit, getting to know them.
Could you describe a moment in time, be it an incident or an episode in your professional or everyday life, where you had to justify the importance of using history for attaining a goal, making change, positive change through your work? And what was your justification for using history?
I've never been explicit about saying, because of the history. I've framed it in a different way, but it does tie to history. For example, I've made personal commitments to get to know my own culture, knowing that it does impact my professional life and my personal life. And so that means going to Longhouse. And I live 7.5 hours away from where I'm from. And these days when ceremony is called do fall within my regular work schedule. And so I've had to have conversations explaining how these experiences and taking part in culture can only benefit my classroom. And it's something that needs to happen. As an Indigenous hire at McGill, I am obligated to take part in these activities. You hired me as an Indigenous person. What are the activities that I'm doing in my personal life that make me Oneida, right? And it is participating in culture. And so I've not explicitly had to say, because of the historical ways in which these processes and our calendar, if you even think about our calendar and what it follows, it doesn't have room for Haudenosaunee ceremonies. And so we are, in Canada, we can take cultural days, religious days. But the thing is, our calendar, our Haudenosaunee calendar, follows the moon cycles. And they're always different, right? So sometimes ceremony can be called 1, 2, 3 days before it happens, and I pack up and I go, right? And so what does that look like for my classroom when I have something scheduled? I have to be in class. And so I've made arrangements and agreements with my faculty that we can be flexible, hosting things online, putting a pre-recording, having a guest lecture, having a colleague step in for me. And there is an understanding that this is acceptable, and I'm sure glad it is, because I would have done it anyways. But yeah, that does reflect deeply on history. Why am I making those efforts? Because I have to go back and connect and make space for that, because it hasn't been, I haven't had, I'm newly introduced to the Longhouse, I would say within the past 3 years. And so it is a commitment that, I encourage even my family to take part in, my mom and my uncles and my nephews, basically whoever wants to come. It coincides with the language as well. I largely do not know what they're saying. I try to position myself beside someone who's fluent, and when it's appropriate, I'll lean over, what did they say? But yeah, it goes back to, why don't I have my language? Because of the education system in Canada. And so everything is interconnected: language learning, cultural activities, my profession, the way that I was hired even.
So when you talk about the Longhouse and ceremony, just for our listeners to understand, what does it involve? Is it a spiritual, religious ceremony? Is it?
Yeah, the Haudenosaunee people have ceremony that is tied to the land. So we celebrate different things in our lives, and to be thankful for different things that were given from the land. our roles. We think a lot about our roles and just how creation is interconnected into everything that we do. So during different seasons, we celebrate and practice different songs and dancing and activities. Can range from, we have midwinter, which is kind of in the new year. We have grieving ceremonies. We have different medicine societies, which none of them I belong to. There are, we celebrate the strawberry and harvest, fall harvest. We give thanks to everything that the earth gives us.
Very interesting. So based on what you've said, what do you think history is? What does it do? I don't know if this is a hard question because the idea of history, the concept of history is a Western.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was just thinking.
Yeah,
I'm like, history in which sense?
Exactly. So
history in the sense where, I'm participating and hearing about who I am from, a Haudenosaunee, Onondaga perspective is learning about how to interact with one another. It's learning about the land, and that guides us into acting relationally with one another, like on an individual level, with our families, with community, and with other nations, right? But then there's like this Western history that is more so I think about teaching and remembering about the past and informs us about how to proceed in the future. That's how I understand it. It's not to say that Indigenous history doesn't do that. It certainly does. That's a good question. I have to think about that one more.
Yeah, it would be interesting. You talked about history's relational dimension. Mm-hmm. So my next question is, does history come alive at a more individual level or at a broader communal level? Or are the two also interrelated?
Oh, I think they're deeply interrelated. One of the things that I'm trying to do is catch a man, and specifically a Haudenosaunee man. And so I need to learn how to make corn soup for my man. I don't know how to make that. And so when I think about, this being one of our dishes, I have to engage with people where I'm from. I have to learn how to make this dish. And that's a really embarrassing thing to say as a Haudenosaunee woman that I don't know how to make corn soup, but here I am exposing myself. But that's an individual level, right? And those recipes are passed down from generation to generation. I think on a communal level, I think it is also relational. Canada is built on Haudenosaunee leadership and the architecture for what we know, and being having a democracy, a society that votes is largely based on the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So when we think about that history, it is deeply relational on a national scale.
If you can climb up that imaginary ladder and look down again, based on what you've said so far, would history be a good thing? Or could history also be a bad thing?
I think it's about how you approach it in your mind. We can learn different aspects of history that have had good effects and bad effects. It serves as a blueprint for what's happened and how to proceed. Did you just ask me if history is a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, based on what you've said, would you say, what you've just described is a positive side of what history does? It seems like it's a good thing in a way. But can history have the opposite effect too at times without people realizing? Or
yeah, well, depending on who your historical source is, history can have a negative effect. If we didn't have Indigenous people telling their own stories, doing their own research, and we only had accounts from textbooks from non-Indigenous people written from a anthropological perspective, that wouldn't be an accurate reflection of history. So I think it depends what the context is, who's saying it, why it's being shared. It can be both good and bad. The things that we're learning about, we can learn about things, but if we're not being critical about them and how we're going to proceed, I think that also has a different effect. I think about my own research and how I approach it as well. I'm Haudenosaunee person working with Anishinaabe peoples, right? And we share a treaty. We share a dish with one spoon treaty, which is an agreement to share the land together that overlaps or intersects, because we don't have like straight lines drawn through the land, right? A lot of our territories are overlapping, right? And so it's an agreement saying we both live here and we will take care of this land together. And so when I think about that in terms of my research, I'm working with Anishinaabe people on their lands, and how am I going to take care of this research? How am I going to nurture it in a way that is encompassing of their values, of their history, of their people, of their culture, of their language, in respecting, and I think about respecting them and respecting the future, and what I'm leaving for people to look to and say, oh, I don't think of myself as someone who's going to have like big impacts, but just in case someone looks at my research one day and says like, oh, Michelle highlighted this here or this there, I want to make sure that it's accurate and good and done in a good way, because we are part of history. Even
Yes.
Right now our everything that we do, generations to come will have benefits from our actions, or maybe be more disadvantaged from our actions.
So this understanding you were talking about regarding the sharing of the land, is it maintained through an oral
So
tradition?
there is a renewal of treaties, I believe annually. I've never been to one, but we also have the Great Law of Peace, where it's recited annually. It's picked, the location is picked, I think a few months in advance. But yeah, these relationships are tended to, and nations gather to hear and take part in the reciting of treaties and our ways of being.
Michelle Kennedy, thank you.
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me. It's been a nice time.